The word Texas evokes images of cowboys, huge cattle ranches, and oil pumps, the very heart of the Wild West. The beach, on the other hand, doesn't normally spring to mind, but all you have to do is look at a map to see the state has more than 300 miles of coastline, including numerous islands stuck out in the Gulf of Mexico. Of all these islands, none is more famous than Galveston. The city on the island that shares its name was one of the largest and most prosperous in Texas. Since it was first founded, Galveston has been waging a two-front war for survival against the forces of nature and against the changes to the economy that have been repeatedly rendering it obsolete. Time and again, Galveston has been struck by catastrophe, from hurricanes to the departure of key industries, and time and again, the city has rebuilt and rebranded. In the process, it has forged a culture unique to itself among its residents. Galvestonians have long prided themselves in doing things differently than the rest of Texas. Over the years, Galveston has been a pirate hideaway, a prosperous shipping port, the vice capital of the Southwest, and a family-friendly tourist spot. All of them, in one way or another, taking advantage of the city's strategic location next to the sea. But Galveston's position is a precarious one. There is a real concern that one day the ocean might swallow the island whole, turning Galveston into a modern-day Atlantis. Welcome to Geographics. I'm your interim host, Eric Malachite, cosmic horror author and production manager behind the scenes here. Today's episode was written by Ben Edelman. If they've provided their socials, go give them a follow, as they'll be linked alongside my own. With that said, go ahead and like, subscribe, comment down below, and get ready to learn about Galveston, destruction and rebirth on the Cowboy Riviera. Galveston is the easternmost of a chain of barrier islands that line the Texas coast all the way down to the Mexican border. Barrier islands are formed by wave action. The ocean is constantly moving sediment from one place to another, depositing it in piles, the largest of which become islands. At its core, a barrier island is essentially a giant sand dune. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, Galveston was occupied seasonally by the Karankawa tribe of American Indians, who called the island, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Ayuia. The Karankawa were a nomadic tribe of hunter-gatherers that, according to legend, engaged in ritual cannibalism, though many think that that was simply made up as an excuse to wipe them out. The first European to visit the island in 1528 did so by accident. A Spanish explorer named, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Cabeza de Vaca, washed ashore on a raft, one of the few survivors of a disastrous expedition launched by Santo Domingo the year before. Cabeza de Vaca ended up spending several years living among the Karankawa and other tribes before rejoining Spanish civilization in 1536. The island took its modern name from the bay it separates from the Gulf of Mexico, which was named Galveston Bay by Spanish explorer José de Evia in 1785. De Evia named the place after Bernardo de Galvez, the viceroy of New Spain, making Galveston just one more example of places in the Americas with names given to them by men trying to suck up to their bosses. The first permanent European settlements on Galveston Island were built in 1816 by pirates who were looking for a place to hide out from American and Spanish authorities. The most famous of these buccaneers was the celebrated Jean Lafitte, a French pirate who is best known for assisting General Andrew Jackson in defeating the British at New Orleans during the War of 1812. Lafitte ruled over a pirate kingdom on Galveston he called Campeche, complete with houses, shops, taverns, and a court system to prosecute anyone who broke the settlement's laws. But the days of piracy were coming to an end, and in 1821 the US Navy told Lafitte that if he didn't abandon Galveston, they would force him off. Lafitte chose discretion over valor and burned his pirate kingdom to the ground before he left. After that, the island fell under the control of the government of Mexico, who had just completed a successful war of independence from Spain. They established the port of Galveston and a customs house, but they wouldn't be in charge on the island for long. In 1835, tensions between Mexico's central government and the residents of the country's Texas province boiled over into rebellion. The Texians, who were largely English-speaking transplants from the United States, declared their independence, forming the Republic of Texas. Galveston temporarily served as the capital of the new republic when the government was forced to flee to the island in the wake of an army led by General Antonio Santa Anna, who famously massacred the defenders of the Alamo before being defeated by Sam Houston in the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836. The city of Galveston was formally chartered in 1839 and quickly became Texas's main port city, becoming part of the United States in 1845 when Texas was annexed by Washington. In 1861, Galveston found itself under another flag, that of the Confederacy, when Texas seceded from the Union following the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency. Like other southern ports, Galveston was blockaded by the Union Navy to prevent rebel ships from entering or leaving, and they briefly occupied the island in 1862 before being driven off in the Battle of Galveston on New Year's Day, 1863. That same day, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in the rebel states to be free, went into effect. Galveston would have another role in Civil War history 2 years later in 1865 when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston following the collapse of the Confederacy as the state's military governor. On June 19th, Granger issued General Order No. 3, announcing that the Emancipation Proclamation would now be enforced in Texas, the only rebel state that hadn't yet been compelled to free their slaves. Ever since, the act has been celebrated as Juneteenth, a holiday commemorating the end of slavery, recently made a federal holiday in the United States. Spared the destruction of other southern cities like Richmond and Atlanta, Galveston quickly emerged from the war as one of the most profitable ports not only in the South, but in the entire country. The city's ports were teeming with shipments of cotton, grain, and other trade goods. The central business district, the Strand, was known as the Wall Street of the Southwest, and Victorian-style mansions to house the wealthy residents were going up all over the city. Like many port towns, the island became a center for immigration, particularly Germans starting in the 1870s. By the end of the 19th century, Galveston was a thriving metropolis of 38,000 and was, per capita, one of the wealthiest cities in the country. And then, in one disastrous day, almost all of it was destroyed. There had been hurricanes in Galveston before. One storm during the days of Jean Lafitte had forced the pirate to rebuild his settlement from the ground up. But in the latter decades of the 19th century, as multiple storms came and went, only dealing minor damage to the island, Galveston residents began to believe that their city would be safe from the worst that Mother Nature could throw at them. The way tropical cyclones worked was little understood by meteorologists at the time, and municipal planning had no contingencies for mass evacuations of residents as might be seen today. It was a recipe for disaster. The hurricane that struck Galveston on September 8, 1900 was a monster, with wind speeds topping 140 miles per hour, classifying it as a Category 4 storm according to the Saffir-Simpson scale. The winds brought with them a storm surge exceeding 15 feet that quickly flooded the entire island, which at the time was only 8.7 feet above sea level at its highest point. All 4 bridges connecting the island with the mainland were also destroyed, trapping the residents in a watery nightmare. One by one, the city's buildings were torn apart by the wind and water, with debris from one house serving as ammunition to destroy the next. Galvestonians died by the thousands, drowned, crushed to death in the wreckage of their houses, or killed by the deadly projectiles flung around by the wind. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the entire city had been effectively obliterated. The scale of the destruction was horrifying. No building in Galveston escaped damage, and over 3,600 homes and 600 businesses were completely destroyed. An estimated 10,000 people became homeless overnight. But worst of all was the human cost. Dead bodies were everywhere. So many that it completely overwhelmed the survivors' ability to deal with them. Initially, bodies were loaded onto ships and buried at sea, but when the tides began washing those bodies back onto the island, the decision was made to burn them. Men had to be rounded up and forced at gunpoint to do this nightmare-inducing work, and were supplied with whiskey in an attempt to dull their senses. The Galveston hurricane is, to this day, the deadliest disaster in the history of the United States, with an estimated death toll ranging from 6,000 on the low end and 12,000 on the high end. Had it occurred today, it would have done an estimated $139 billion in damage, a costlier total than even Hurricane Katrina. Many people believe that Galveston would never be rebuilt, or that the city would relocate to the mainland. One thing was for sure, the so-called golden era of Galveston was definitely over. In an effort to prevent a similar disaster from ever happening again, Galveston constructed a 17-foot-high seawall that would eventually stretch across 10 miles of the island's western coastline. An even more ambitious project than that, however, was the raising of the entire island by pumping an estimated 15 million cubic yards of sand from the bottom of the bay. Over 2,000 surviving buildings in Galveston were raised up on jack screws to allow sand to be pumped in underneath them. In some places, the height of the island was raised as much as 17 feet. But while the city was rebuilding, competition was destroying what had been Galveston's chief industry: shipping. The city of Houston, 50 miles northwest of Galveston, had long been jealous of the exclusive position the island had in the port trade, and decided to build a deepwater port of their own. In 1914, the Houston Ship Channel was completed, ending Galveston's monopoly on the region's shipping. Making things even more lopsided was Houston's close proximity to the Texas oil boom, which would eventually make Houston one of the largest and richest cities in the country. Galveston needed a new source of income, and it would eventually find it in the form of prohibition. Galveston already had a reputation as a wide-open city where illegal gambling and prostitution were prevalent, but the nationwide ban on alcohol only served to jumpstart the city's transformation into a den of vice. Millions of dollars in liquid was being smuggled into the country through Galveston on a near-constant basis, providing much of the contraband being consumed in speakeasies in cities as far away as Denver. Post Office Street was well known as the city's red light district, home to hundreds of prostitutes that plied their trade within the walls of dozens of brothels. The whole show was run by the Mateo brothers, Big Sam and Rosario, known as Papa Rose. The Mateos ran the gambling racket in Galveston, installing slot machines all over the island and running card games at elaborate clubs like the Balinese Room, located on the end of a pier so that they had enough time to hide the gambling paraphernalia in case the police raided them. That rarely happened. City officials were almost flagrantly corrupt, everyone seemingly in the pocket of the Mateos. What set Galveston apart from other cities of this period was that they actively embraced the vice industry. After all, it was making everyone a lot of money, transforming the island into a top tourist destination. The Great Depression hardly made a blip in Galveston, largely as a result of the rackets. The Mateos employed their own private police force, known as the Night Riders, who kept order in town. As a result, violent crime was rare, and the tourists who flocked to the island could be reasonably sure that the money in their wallets wouldn't be stolen from them before they had a chance to lose it at the tables. The inhabitants of Galveston have always thought of themselves as being separate from the rest of Texas, not only physically but culturally, and their embrace of this new industry was just one more example of that. Islanders proclaimed themselves the Free State of Galveston and turned the Mateos into respected local citizens, at the top of the list of invitees for charity galas and civic events. Even after Prohibition ended in 1933, Galveston retained its perch as the state's Sin City, relying on the gambling and prostitution rings that continued to flourish in town. That state of affairs would last until the mid-1950s, by which time both Mateo brothers had died. A nationwide crackdown on organized crime largely undid their organization, with most gangsters either transitioning into legitimate business or migrating to America's new gambling capital, Las Vegas. With the departure of the rackets, the tourist industry collapsed, taking with it the rest of the island's economy. Galveston entered a long period of economic decline, accompanied by a population decrease, from a high of 67,000 in 1960 down to less than 48,000 in 2010. Beginning in the 1980s, Galveston began to rebrand itself as a family-friendly tourist destination. The problem with getting tourists to come to the beach was that, by this point, Galveston didn't have a beach. Barrier islands like Galveston are constantly being eroded by wave action, as the same force which formed the island gradually chips away at it. The construction of the seawall only accelerated this process, as the power of the waves was reflected back onto the sand. 20 years after the seawall was built, the island had lost 300 feet of beach. To combat this, the city has commissioned a number of beach nourishment projects, a fancy term for dredging sand from the bottom of the ocean and using it to create a new beach. The beach nourishment projects, along with investment in hotels, restaurants, and other amenities, are accredited with restoring the tourist trade in Galveston, which in 2007 earned over $800 million and brought in 5.4 million visitors to the island. Part of this tourist resurgence is thanks to another rebranding project, the Port of Galveston. While still capable of offloading cargo, more and more space is being devoted at the port to the cruise ship industry, which in 2019 embarked more than 2.2 million passengers at Galveston, making it the 10th busiest cruise port in the world. Almost every major cruise line, including Carnival and Royal Caribbean, have ship docks there, and a third dedicated cruise ship terminal, built at a cost of $100 million, was opened in November 2022. Galveston is also home to other industries that contribute to its economy besides tourism. The University of Texas Medical Branch opened in 1891, and it is the state's oldest medical school and teaching hospital. Galveston was picked to host the school in part because of the frequent epidemics of yellow fever that ravaged the island's population during the 19th century. Two other colleges also opened for business on the island in the 1960s. Meanwhile, the American National Insurance Company, or ANICO, was founded on the island in 1905 and has grown to become one of the largest insurance companies in the country. Despite the protections taken on Galveston after the killer storm of 1900, the island is still vulnerable to the ravages of Mother Nature. In 1961, Hurricane Carla spared Galveston from a direct hit, making landfall to the south, but the storm spawned a violent F4 tornado in Galveston that wrecked more than 200 city buildings and resulted in 8 deaths. Despite the protections taken on Galveston after the killer storm of 1900, the island is still vulnerable to the ravages of Mother Nature. In 1983, the Category 3 Hurricane Alicia made landfall on Galveston, killing 13, destroying buildings, and cutting power to the entire island. The most recent tropical storm to score a direct hit on Galveston is Hurricane Ike in 2008. Ike brought a storm surge of over 20 feet to Galveston, overtopping the 17-foot high sea wall and causing extensive flooding. The storm surge also swept around the island to the unprotected backside that faced Galveston Bay, resulting in even more damage. Many of Galveston's most historic structures were either damaged or destroyed, including the Balinese Room, which was swept out to sea along with the pier it stood on. Every hurricane that hits Galveston only makes the erosion the island has been undergoing for decades worse, with Hurricane Alicia alone eroding over 250 feet of beach on the island's west side. Even without major storms helping the event, the erosion of Galveston Island is still accelerating, with some parts of the island disappearing at a rate of 8 feet a year. To combat the erosion, Galveston has engaged in a number of projects, including the already mentioned beach nourishment programs and the construction of breakwaters to reduce the wave action on the beaches. But at best, these can only slow down the process and can only protect parts of the island, not the whole thing. Part of the reason for the acceleration of erosion on Galveston is the effects of climate change, which not only is making Atlantic hurricanes more powerful and thus more destructive, it is also raising the sea level. Experts now are projecting that the sea level on the western Gulf Coast will rise as much as 25 inches by 2050. Which would put large swaths of the island underwater for at least part of the year. There is real concern among some scientists that by the end of this century, Galveston could become virtually uninhabitable, swallowed up by the ocean like an American version of Atlantis. In spite of this, residents of Galveston aren't planning to go anywhere. In fact, property development on the island has only increased in recent years, particularly vacation rentals, in part because of the National Flood Insurance Program, which pays out damage claims to properties suffering flood damage, backed of course by the federal government. Beachfront property is still highly desirable, even if it comes with a risk that the beach will eventually disappear, taking your house with it. Much of the discussion around how to protect Galveston from the Gulf revolves around the so-called Ike Dike, a proposed massive expansion to the island's seawall that would extend it to the entire length of the island, as well as on the neighboring Bolivar Peninsula. The new barrier would have floodgates, which would allow any floodwaters to be easily drained back into the sea once the storm has passed. The project, first proposed in 2009, has yet to move beyond the planning stage, in part because of difficulties in securing the estimated $34 billion needed to build it. Galveston Island has always been a strange place for a settlement. Many of the necessary elements required to make a city are absent on the island, including fresh water, which is pumped in from the mainland. But the attraction mankind has to the sea is as irresistible now as it has always been. And it is likely that as long as there is a Galveston Island, people will come there, either to work, live, or play. The real question is, how long will there be a Galveston Island? And is there anything its inhabitants can do to protect their home from the relentless power of the same water that makes it such a desirable place to live in the first place? That's a problem for future Galveston, and the residents, if there are any. So I hope you enjoyed this video and found it as entertaining and informative as I have. Big thanks to Ben Edelman for the fantastic script, and be sure to follow myself, check out my books, and follow Ben if he's provided us social media links. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.